Why don't we have the social revolutions that plagued France? We could argue, why doesn't England have it after 1688? But we kind of understand this. This was an 88-year process in England to have this constitutionalism. Why did we never have this in the United States? Take a guess.
The colony wanted to separate from that.
Yeah, we had a political revolution, we separated, but why not a social revolution?
Because we already had electoral laws in place, and the Union never had anything.
No, kind of close, It's kind of a rhetorical question. I want you to be thinking about it. I'll give you an answer. Again, we're not talking about U.S. history here or Western Civ, but I'll just tell you here. So here's England, here's Europe, Spain, here is the United States. Obviously not to scale. I'll go ahead and put something. Okay. So Europe has a history that dates from around 500 to 1500. And what was Europe from 500 to 1500? What was that era referred to as? Medieval period, right? It was defined by feudalism. Remember, no modern nation states. So it's a feudal era. And so we're looking at 1,000 years. And that includes not only Europe, but also England. Okay? So when the United States is formed, who is moving over to the United States? Now, yes, we get actually people from all over Europe. Most of them are from England, but absolutely they're from all over Europe. Who's going there? Are we getting the poorest of the poor?
No.
No. Why not? Super easy. They're poor.
Yes.
They can't afford the ticket, right? Super easy. Are we getting the super rich?
No.
Why?
Because they don't want to die.
It's hard out here. They have no desire. They have their own estates. They have their own aristocratic history. There's no urgency. So what we're really getting here are the Midland sorts. Okay? The Midland. And this is not a word, so I'll put it in quotes. But the Midland sorts. And the wonderful thing about the Midland sorts is that they are almost all literate. It's a big deal. They can all read, for the most part. But we're talking 95%. Okay, what's the literacy rate in England? Well, among the Midland groups, probably in the upper 90s, right? Among the aristocrats, probably in the upper 90s or higher. What about the poorer folks? Rural farmer types? No, we're talking maybe, okay? So, what about in France? When we're talking about this revolution, 1789, who is pushing for the second reign of terror? Are we actually having the guys with pitchforks and poop, going? No. They are the ones that are being led by mostly students, academics. Their literacy rate is much less. Even among the Midland sorts, you're looking at a literacy rate probably closer to 60%, right? And for the lower folks, most do not read. The aristocrats have a lower, even still, than the Midland, but it's not a huge part. Now, of course, among academics, everybody reads. So why doesn't the U.S.? Well, because Europe and England has 1,000 years to get past. England has the advantage because it's an island state, right? They can kind of have a little bit more control, so they can kick out the king, they can bring in somebody else. They have James I, who's absolute, Charles I, who's an absolute. He loses his head. They have this big civil war under Cromwell. And then Charles II comes in saying, well, I won't be so absolute. And then James II says, I'm going back to absolutism. And then the Glorious Revolution. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit more controlled. They are able to have this intellectual tradition. The people who are leading this tradition are also some of the people that are going over to the colonies, at least nearby. The people in the colonies are fully aware of the philosophers that helped to promote this Enlightenment, this revolution in England. So when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, he is using John Locke, who writes in 1688, that's the Revolution, he actually writes in 1692, doesn't matter. Thomas Jefferson is writing in 1776, 100 years later. The words he used, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the creator certain unalienable rights. He's taking a 2-paragraph section from John Locke's treatise on several government, and he's reducing it to a nice thing. Everybody who reads this knows exactly where it came from. They all know. And not only everybody in England, well, when I say everybody in England, certainly the aristocrats, the people in Parliament, they all know what he's talking about, but we all know it. So the U.S. doesn't have this legacy. So once we have the political revolution, we just hit the ground running. When do we get universal suffrage for men? Not counting slaves, because slaves weren't considered. But you guys do realize that even before the Civil War, blacks could vote in certain states. If you're a slave, you're not considered a citizen. But if you're a citizen, then you could vote, right? When did we get this? Like 1820s. Immediately, most people were able to vote, but we did have some property requirements. We did have some, especially in the Northeast. But by the time you get to Andrew Jackson, his whole argument is that everybody should vote on everything. This is a radical idea compared to the world at the time. Nobody was doing it. England slowly expanded their voting rolls. Slowly expanding their voting rolls. They did this in the 1850s, and then they did it again in the 1870s, but they don't really complete this until the 19-teens. Yes, Maria?
Yeah, but then didn't they have a problem like in Rome where they tried to vote for everything and then they had to come up with
Yeah, no, we're not talking about direct democracy. The point is that you vote for people who will then vote for you. It's still an indirect, it's still a republic. The point is what they were doing, the way they were expanding voting rights in England is that they were lowering the property rights. So at first, you voted if you had a title. This goes back to James I. The Parliament is made up of the nobles. By the end of the Glorious Revolution, you're beginning to also recognize wealthy peasants, right? So then if you have an estate, if you have a lot of property, you have skin in the game, you get to vote. So we shift from the titles to some type of estates, certain amount of property. This means that you've done something in society, you are a stakeholder in society. Well, we reduce that to maybe not an estate, but some type of property. Maybe you have a house in the city. Maybe you have a big house in the city. You then also have a stake. And slowly, England expands the voting rolls by limiting this. Then finally you say, well, okay, as long as you have an address, okay. Now, to us, we look at this, we say, well, of course everyone should vote. But you have to look at this from their perspective, not our modern perspective. At the time, in the United States, people like Andrew Jackson would say everybody should vote, because when he's talking about everybody, who is he talking about? These middling, that almost everybody is literate. They all can read a newspaper. They all know what the issues are. They all can be informed voters. When you're talking about, say, France, how many of these guys know what the issues are? Even in England, how many of them really can make an informed decision? This is something that's a very real situation. We had reformers that said in the very first part of the French Revolution, the king is doing a terrible job, we need to depose the king, 1789. And then these radicals come in. And the way the radicals work is that they kind of harness all the peasants, not the wealthy peasants, but the really poor peasants, and say they're taking stuff away from you. And mostly, if you look at the history, it's not the rural peasants, it's not the farmers, it's the urban peasants. High unemployment, not a lot of money, and they say, well, you don't have any money because the wealthy people took it from you. And so we kind of use them as a sort of an army. Now, this is not unusual for us. I don't want to make modern comments and stuff, but all these high school kids that are being very politically active, are they actually being politically active? No, they're people that are kind of directing. Well, same exact thing is happening in the French Revolution. It's not really the peasants that are coming up with these ideas. There's people that are feeding it to them. And the reason why this is important is that people look at reform and they say, if you give the poop scooper right to vote, he's only going to vote for things that are selfish. He doesn't know about the interests of the state as a whole. He only knows about what he wants. He sees that guy's got money, he doesn't have any money, I want his money. So we can't give the poop scooper, the illiterate poop scooper, the right to vote, because if we do, you're going to have a reign of terror again. And it's not a completely unfounded fear. When we have Alexis de Tocqueville, you guys have all heard the name, you may not remember why you hear it. He wrote a book called Democracy in America. He's French. He's a French, kind of a pseudo-aristocrat from 1830. This is a time when we're kind of going back to the reform era. We're going back and forth. He goes to the United States and he's saying, why hasn't the United States had these revolutions? Because we seem to have them all the time in France. We have one revolution, they quash it, we have some order, and then we have it again, and they quash. Why isn't the United States doing this? His conclusion was that the United States was very, very religious. The United States had a sense of kind of belonging to groups and organizations, and so everyone felt like they were actually part of the process. And more than anything, almost everyone's literate. So because of this, the United States hasn't had this. Now, de Tocqueville's actually surprised by these results, because back home, the assumption is if you give the poor the vote, you'll have revolution. The reason why I'm saying this over and over again is that this is a very real problem that they're worrying about. This shift from the constitutionalism, where we want change, constantly being fought by this radicalism, and the antidote to radicalism is order. It goes back and forth because in European history, they did not make this transition very freely. And if you really think about it, did the English transition come without bloodshed? No, nor was it easy, right? It took them another 80 years. The United States kind of a bit spoiled, if you think about it, because they are the children of the people that did all the work in England. They didn't have to create the theories. The theories were already there. Thomas Jefferson takes the ideas that are already there, and that's where we get our American Revolution. But we don't have to fight and overturn all these traditions. In Europe, that's exactly what they're having to do all the time. And the fear is you've got all these people that are really genuinely uneducated, and they will lead to radicalism. So here's this other little weird situation. And this is the point that I was trying to make last class, and hopefully you'll get it. Your textbooks are really funny on this subject. This is all about Enlightenment ideals.